Director Alex Gibney and writers Bethany McLean and Peter Elkin are here. Their new movie is Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room. It is a story of how the top executive from one of America's largest companies walked away with over $1 billion, while investors and employees lost almost everything. Here is the trailer for the film.
It had taken Enron 16 years to go from about $10 billion of assets to $65 billion of assets. It took them 24 days to go bankrupt.
The fatal flaw at Enron was pride, arrogance, intolerance.
Well, that's why you guys stole from those poor grandmothers.
We can add $1 gazillion to the bottom line.
All right, that sounds fantastic.
Did you convert stock worth $66 million?
I don't know.
I netted approximately $100 million.
Enron is a company that deals with everyone with absolute integrity.
To argue about my compensation, and if I step on somebody's throat on the way, that doubles it, well, I'll stomp on the guy's throat.
The other thing about people at Enron is a lot of them were former nerds. You wanted to be the most popular guy on Wall Street, and you were going to do whatever you had to do.
They sought out every loophole they could in order to profit.
The rules weren't quite clear.
They could bury debt, they could bury losses.
An industry that was very reliable for 100 years was all of a sudden turned into a casino.
Those guys could just yank the California economy on its leash whenever they wanted to, and they did it, and they did it, and they did it.
He just steals money from California to the tune of $1 million or $2 a day.
Can we rephrase that?
Could I predict phony energy crisis as a result of deregulation? Yes. Could I predict that Arnold Schwarzenegger would be our governor as a result of deregulation?
Oh, I didn't expect that.
How exactly does Enron make its money?
Accounting doesn't get that creative.
I would like to know if you are on crack.
This is the shredded evidence that came out of Enron.
Everyone was on the bandwagon, and it can happen again.
We are the good guys. We are on the side of angels.
It has evolved to the corporate crime of the century.
I am pleased to welcome them to this table. We know the story of Enron. We've talked about that on this program a lot. We've read what you guys have written. How did this become a documentary?
Well, I read the book. I mean, I wasn't convinced it would make a great film until I read the book. And what was so great about the book was that it wasn't a story about numbers, it was a story about people. And the characters were so fascinating.
Yes.
That's right. And also there was a tone to the book that I really liked, which was a kind of darkly comic tone. As sad as the Enron story was at the end, you know, there was a lot that was very funny about it. But the dark humor, or black humor, is kind of comedy with an undercurrent of moral outrage. And I really liked the tone that Peter and Bethany had in the book.
Yeah. So, I mean, what was your hope when you set out on this project?
Well, right after Alex had read the book, he told us his takeaway, and immediately he saw the Enron story in the same terms we did. He saw it as a story about people, and he saw it as a story that had really an element of tragedy to it. It was a story about really human failings.
They're real losers here, people who lose everything. Yeah.
Right.
And some real losers, too.
People on the outside think of it as a story about numbers, and just a story about complicated financial shenanigans that you can't understand, and even if you could, you wouldn't want to understand. Yeah. And Alex was really able to get underneath that immediately.
So it's a story in your mind. It's a story of what, other than greed and...
It's a story of all too human flaws, because even greed and arrogance and the things that took Enron down, they're very human failings. And I think that's a real part of the story here.
Yeah. Who's the biggest villain in this story?
Well, I think the culture at Enron is.
Yeah.
I think the culture is what transformed people who were could have been decent people and productive people in a different world.
Yeah, well, define that culture. I mean, these are good people who became somehow seduced by a culture?
Yes.
And the culture was?
It was incredibly mercenary. It was deal-driven. It was cutthroat. It was arrogant. It was, we're better than anybody else, and we're smarter than anybody else, and we'll do whatever it takes to get away with things.
And we have no restraints?
No bounds, no limits. That's right.
Yeah. I mean, that seemed to me to be the thing that just kept driving home to me. Well, there is no restraint. We will do what we want.
Right. Well, one of the ironies is that Enron talks...
Spend what we want, earn what we want, buy what we want.
Well, and the upside of that is that anything is possible. The downside of that is you don't stop when you need to stop.
Meaning that you have no...
You don't have the self-limits, you don't have the systems in place.
And pretty soon you're not in control of stopping.
That's right.
Yeah.
Things spin out of control as they did.
Now let's just talk about some of these characters. Skilling? Tell me.
Jeff Skilling is really the contradictory character at the heart of the Enron story because he's the guy who created the modern Enron. Harvard Business School educated, worked at McKinsey, just a blue chip background. And he's the guy who made Enron from a company that was a pipeline company, you know, steel in the ground, kind of boring old economy stuff, into this company that was supposedly built on intellectual capital that could trade anything from gas to electricity to pulp and paper. And Jeff was a brilliant guy. People describe him as incandescently brilliant, and he had kind of a Pied Piper quality to his intelligence.
People who would know that describe him that way.
Yeah, and he had a Pied Piper quality to his intelligence. People were willing to follow him anywhere. But with all of that came some really dangerous things. He had the consultant sort of love of the idea. He liked the idea above all else, and he didn't really care how the idea was turned into reality.
And the idea was a great trading company that could trade anything anywhere in the world and be the biggest.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
At one time, Enron was what? The number of what? Largest company?
Seventh largest company.
Right. Go ahead.
Well, also Skilling was an interesting character, a very American character, almost Gatsby-like. He transforms himself physically from this geeky nerd into a real macho man. Suddenly, you know, there's hair on his...
You see it all take place in your movie.
Yeah, it's really an extraordinary physical transformation. I mean, because one of the things that Enron did is they made it up, but they made it up in a very grand way. I mean, it was a grand illusion because it almost became this wonderful movie set of a company. And Skilling very much played the role to the hilt of the kind of macho trader that would take no prisoners in the marketplace.
Yeah, I actually think that I mean, we're all now fascinated by what happens in corporate America, and corporate players have become, there's a cult of personality about them, and some say it's on the rise, and some say it's declined a bit, you know, because of what happened to some people that we've all seen. But my belief is that if Shakespeare was writing today, he'd be writing about the intrigue of powerful corporations. I mean, Tom Friedman has a column today about where are the CEOs in terms of doing something good, you know, beyond just making a lot of money. But that's what probably attracted you to do the kind of work you do, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
You know,
It's
I mean,
because
these are interesting stories of all these larger-than-life things.
Right, this is where the power is.
Power, money, greed, lust,
right.
revenge,
That's
sex.
Right. That's right. It's played out on a huge scale, and there seems to be no checking. I mean, the interesting thing about business now is that there are very few countervailing forces. So there's so much power concentrated in such few hands that some wild things are going on.
Talk about Fasto and who he was and why he and where he is today.
Andy Fasto has pled guilty to committing lots of crimes at Enron. He ultimately pocketed more than $60 million on private side deals where he set up a partnership that was doing business with a company whose pocketbook he was supposed to be minding.
Yeah.
Andy Fasto's got a deal where he's going to go to prison for 10 years. His wife is now already in prison. And he is going to be a star witness in the trial of Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling early next year.
Yeah, everybody wonders, I mean, they wonder about Skilling and they wonder about Lay. There was always, when I talked to reporters covering this, the notion of whether Ken Lay would even be indicted. There were always people who believed, you know, that somehow the forces to be there would be something they would find. But on the other hand, they said this was a guy that didn't relieve a lot of fingerprints, that he could, in some degrees, legitimately plead, I didn't know.
Right. Well, he was not a guy who was very hands-on in terms of the day-to-day affairs of Enron. Yeah. At the same time, he was also the guy who was there from the very beginning, who set the culture of the place and is, in a broad way, very responsible for what happened. In addition, as CEO of the company for almost all of Enron's life, he's the guy who led Andy Fasto, who voted with the board to let Andy Fasto set up partnerships that were doing these sleazy deals with the company.
And he was a guy who was a friend of the president.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he took hundreds of millions in compensation from the company on the theory that he was such a great CEO, that he deserved all this money. So it's a little bit ironic now to hear him saying, I was a terrible CEO, I knew nothing.
Yeah, and exactly. I mean, he's basically saying, give me $100 million because I'm the great leader. And now he's saying, I didn't really know.
Didn't really know.
Right.
That's right.
And he literally blames it all on Fasto and says, you know, among other things, Andy Fasto was a horrible CFO of the company. Well, he's the CEO. He's supposed to make sure he's got someone responsible in place.
Take a look at this. We'll see Enron in a second, but there's his Jeff Skilling. Take a look.
I think Jeff Skilling had a desperate need to believe that Enron was a success. I think he identified with Enron. He proclaimed at one point, I am Enron.
The other thing about people at Enron is a lot of them were former nerds, and including Jeff Skilling.
He had been paunchy, he had big glasses, he losing his hair, and Jeff Skilling one day kind of woke up and decided to change himself. And he started working out, lost a lot of weight, but he really did remake himself through sheer will and force of personality.
When Jeff got LASIK on his eyes, everybody at Enron got LASIK, so nobody was wearing glasses.
I think Jeff Skilling is really a tragic figure in a classic sense of the word. He's a guy that people describe as incandescently brilliant, but he's also a guy who is radically different than he at times portrays himself. He's portrayed himself as somebody who has very tightly monitored risk. In reality, he's a gambler. He gambled away huge sums of money before he was 20 years old by making wild bets on the market.
You have retreated from taking credit, but lots of people give you credit for asking the question, where does all the money come from? What led you to ask that question about Enron in 2001?
It really was a phone call from a skeptic of Enron, a guy named Jim Chanos, who was short Enron stock. He'd made a bet it was going to decline in value. And in a conversation with him...
If you write an article, it would certainly help.
In a conversation with him, he said, I think you should take a closer look at Enron's financial statements. And I worked in finance before I became a reporter,
Right.
so it was pretty clear when you looked at Enron's financial statements, not that this was a fraud, and I fault myself for not pushing harder. And I only asked the question, which is why I say I didn't break the story. But when you looked at Enron's financial statements, the company was producing very little cash flow. Its debt was rising rapidly. There were all sorts of things that just didn't make sense. And among the people who covered the company, who were supposed to know what this company was doing, it was clear they just didn't have a clue. They were just taking it on faith. And whenever you've got a stock that people are taking on faith, it becomes a really scary thing.
How many not Enron in terms of the depth of the size as well as the depth of the fraud. How many companies think are like that? I mean, they're there and nobody really knows where the money is.
I think they're probably more out there than we would all like to feel.
Built on a house of cards, or at least built on a house of ignorance.
Right. But a lot of companies, though, have a lot more of a sustainable business than Enron did. We all joke Enron's business was manufacturing earnings. Most companies actually have a business that really produces earnings, and then they cheat around the edges.
Exactly.
Enron cheated to the core.
They're prepared to meet their estimates so that the price will go up.
Right. But it's at the edges. Enron cheated to the core.
Yeah.
There was very little else there. Yeah. And so that's why the company fell apart so quickly.
Everybody asks you this question. Is Enron simply a very large example of people who went wrong for all the reasons we've cited, or does it represent something endemic to the corporate culture in the world?
I think it's endemic to the corporate culture. I think it's sort of the dark side of human impulses that need to be tempered and need to be controlled. And they need to be controlled by good regulation and by people with a conscience and strong...
So good regulation would prevent the Enrons and the WorldComs of the future?
No single thing would do that, because people that are determined to do bad things can find ways often to get around them. But you need systems in place like a tough general counsel who will say no, like a board of directors that will provide meaningful insight, like a risk control system that will really maintain a watch on things.
And where was the board here?
The board was asleep at the switch.
Are they liable, and are they going to be in trouble?
Well, they've been sued, certainly, and they may end up paying some out of their own pockets, like some boards of directors have recently. But they're, of course, pointing the fingers at management, who said they didn't keep them informed about what was going on. Everyone's pointing fingers at everyone else.
All right, here's Ken Lay telling the Enron staff that everything is fine after Skilling has resigned. And Skilling resigned at what point?
August 2001.
Yeah. Basically, had he done this before? Had he left an executive role before? This
He never had such a big executive role, and he left so suddenly. This never happens.
He had just taken over as CEO months before that. It was very abrupt.
Okay, and he basically says what? He's going away to do this for...
He says total personal reasons.
Personal reasons.
And the real reason was?
No one knows the real reason, but Enron stock had begun to slide dramatically, and a lot of the financial vehicles that Enron had used to prop itself up were dependent on its stock price. So as the stock began to slide, the whole illusion that the company had created was in jeopardy. And it's
he knew where it was headed.
Obviously hard not to believe that didn't play a role in Jeff's departure, even if there were some personal aspects to it too. And people do say he was a pretty troubled guy around this time. But, to Jeff, the company was personal. So to say it was personal, the stock price was personal.
Yeah, and his friend committed suicide.
His friend Cliff Baxter committed suicide after the company's bankruptcy.
Roll tape. Here is Ken Lay.
The underlying fundamentals of our businesses are very strong. Indeed, the strongest they've ever been. But regrettably, that's not what Wall Street is focusing on. And I doubt that's what you're focusing on.
rumors were just rampant. I mean, they had started to fly with Jeff Skilling's resignation, but they were kind of a way of life now at Enron.
This inquiry will take a lot of time on the part of our accountants and lawyers and others, but it will finally put these issues to rest.
At the very moment Ken Lay was talking to employees, only a few blocks away, Enron's accounting firm, Arthur Andersen, had begun destroying its Enron files. On October 23rd, Andersen shredded more than 1 ton of paper.
You were able to what's necessary in a documentary to do so you can get an audience of people who are not, you know, readers of the Wall Street Journal and Fortune magazine to come to your theater and see the story?
It's classic drama, really. Follow the characters, follow the money.
Find interesting characters and
I mean, this is a heist film
characters in conflict.
at the end of the day, and
a heist film.
It is, and we watch them pull the heist, and we see what happens, and we see the consequences. And around that, though, there's some very troubling social issues. You know, everybody's concerned about their own money, and I think they see this film and they think, my God, you know, what's going wrong with the country? But along the way, in terms of capturing viewers in the theater, it's all about story. It's all about character.
What are you working on now?
Lots of interesting things.
Nothing you'll tell us.
Well, lots of hopefully interesting things, I should say.
Oh, yes. And you, Peter?
Likewise.
You can never get these people to tell you anything, you know?
Yes.
Yes.
But stay tuned.
All right. Congratulations to all of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. See you next